I'm Sandra Owens, 49, and I went from being the overlooked daughter in a military household to becoming a 2-star Rear Admiral in the United States Navy. For years, I stayed quiet while my family celebrated my brother's service and treated mine like it barely counted. But when he mocked me in front of his watch section, thinking my uniform was just dress up, I made one choice that changed everything. I let the truth speak for itself. Have you ever been dismissed by someone you gave your loyalty to? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being underestimated, hit like and subscribe for more stories about boundaries, dignity, and taking your worth back. What happened next might surprise you. My father wasn't a cruel man. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because the story I'm about to tell could easily be read as an indictment of him, and it isn't meant to be. Robert Owens was a United States Army Sergeant Major, 30 years in uniform, 2 conflicts, more deployments than he ever mentioned at the dinner table in front of my mother. He ran our house in Fayetteville, North Carolina, the same way he ran his unit, by a clear and consistent hierarchy, with expectations stated plainly and consequences delivered without drama. He loved me the way a man loves a daughter he doesn't quite know how to categorize. He put me in a category early, before he had enough information to be accurate about it, and he never looked again to see whether it still fit. The house was near Fort Bragg, a neat, orderly place with military framing on the walls and my father's Army dress uniform displayed in a glass case in the hallway. I grew up reading that uniform the way other children read family photographs, as evidence of what mattered here, what the household was organized around, what success looked like in this particular world. By the time I was 6 years old, I had already understood, without anyone telling me directly, that I existed in a category adjacent to that uniform, but not quite inside it. The uniform was the apex. Everything else arranged itself at a respectful distance below. One evening that year, my father sat across from me at the kitchen table while I worked on a reading assignment. I had already advanced well past my grade level, which was the kind of thing my teachers mentioned at every parent conference, and my father acknowledged once, without particular follow-up. He watched me for a moment, then he said, "Smart is good, Sandra, but it's not the same as tough." He meant it as encouragement, the particular kind a man offers when he wants to prepare a child for a world he believes he understands better than she does. I understood that even at 6. He was not dismissing me. He was managing me, which is a different thing, and which requires a kind of care that I did not doubt he felt. But I also heard the taxonomy underneath the kindness. There is a place for what you are, and here it is. There is a different place for something harder and more valued, and here is where that lives. I filed it without announcing that I had. Children who grow up in structured households learn early to file things quietly. My mother Linda was a warm woman, genuinely warm without calculation or performance of any kind. She agreed with my father the way long-married people agree on things they have never specifically discussed, by assumption, by the accumulated gravity of living inside the same framework, long enough that the framework becomes indistinguishable from reality itself. She was proud of me. She expressed it using the language my father had already established. The bookish one, the capable one, the one who would always be fine. These were meant as compliments, and I received them as compliments. But there was a ceiling built into each of them that I spent the better part of my adult life working my way above, and neither of my parents noticed the climbing while it was actually happening. I was 15 years old on the 10th of June, 1991, when my brother Brandon was born. I remember standing in the doorway of my parents' bedroom watching my father hold his son for the first time, and I remember the expression on his face with a precision that the years have not softened. It was not that he loved Brandon more than he loved me. I do not believe that, and I have never believed it. It was that Brandon represented something my father had been oriented toward his entire adult life. A son, a continuation, a specific kind of possibility that carried a different weight inside the framework he had built around the family. I was 15 years old and already self-sufficient, already accelerating through school on my own momentum, already in the habit of not requiring attention from people who were busy with other priorities. My competence, which I had developed partly to earn recognition and partly because I simply could not help it, had made me easy to leave in place. Brandon arrived, requiring everything. The household reorganized itself around that need without anyone making a conscious decision to reorganize it. That kind of reorganization happens the way most important things happen in families. Quietly, gradually, in the unremarkable space between one ordinary day and the next. I did not resent him. He was a baby who grabbed my finger when I leaned over his crib, and I thought with the clear-eyed practicality of a 15-year-old who had learned to read rooms before she learned to drive. This is what it looks like when the center of gravity shifts. I filed that observation and carried it forward, the way I carried everything, and waited to see what it would mean. By my junior year of high school, I had risen to the top rank in my JROTC unit. Master Sergeant Roy Torres, Army retired, mid-40s, the kind of instructor who measured every cadet by the same rigorous standard, regardless of where they came from or what their parents thought of them, pulled me aside after a drill evaluation and told me plainly that I had the bearing of an officer. He recommended I look at officer candidate pathways after college. He said it the way people say things when they are reporting what they observe, rather than managing what they expect, and the distinction was audible to me even then. I was 17 years old, and it was the first time anyone with genuine military authority had looked at me and named what they saw without framing it as a lesser version of something else. I went home that evening and told my father. He was quiet for a moment, which with Robert Owens always meant he was choosing his words rather than his position. Then he said, "There are officers and there are soldiers, Sandra. Soldiers are the ones who win wars." He meant it with his full conviction. 30 years of enlisted service had given him a truth about where the real work of the military lived, and it was not behind a mahogany desk wearing rank insignia that had not been tested. He was not dismissing me. He was telling me what he knew. But I heard a ceiling underneath it, a specific upper limit on what the family's framework considered possible for someone in my category, positioned just below the place I was already aiming myself. I decided, quietly and without announcing the decision to anyone, to find out for myself which one of us was right. I graduated high school in 1994 and left for university on an ROTC scholarship. I spent 4 years building the academic and physical record that would carry me into officer candidate school. I was disciplined about it in the way I had been disciplined about everything since age 6, when I first understood that my assigned category required sustained and consistent effort to move beyond. My father called periodically to ask how things were going. My mother asked whether I was eating enough and sleeping properly. I told them both what they could follow, and I left the rest in the work, where it belonged and where it would keep until there was something worth showing. I completed officer candidate school in 1999. I was 23 years old. I commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy on a Thursday morning at Naval Station Newport, Rhode Island, standing in my dress whites on a parade ground that smelled like cut grass and the Atlantic. My family did not come. My father had asked 2 nights before the ceremony whether I'd be doing logistics or whether there was a chance I'd see real action. My mother asked whether I was worried about living so far from home. Neither of them asked what the commission would actually require of me, what I was stepping into, what the next 26 years would cost or yield. I told them both the ceremony was on a weekday, that it was a long drive that I completely understood. My OCS classmate, Denise Reyes, had her entire family present. Her mother in a yellow dress, her father in a guayabera, both of them crying openly through the oath of office. After the ceremony, Denise's mother looked around, understood what was absent from my side of the parade ground, and without a word or a hesitation, produced a disposable camera and spent the better part of an hour taking 36 photographs of me in my dress whites from every angle, in every configuration of Newport afternoon light she could find. She mailed them to my duty station 3 weeks later in a padded envelope with a small card that said only, "You looked wonderful. I still have all 36 photographs. I still have the card." There's something I understood standing on that parade ground in 1999, watching Denise's mother navigate through a crowd of strangers to find me and do what my own family had not thought to do. The people who would see my career clearly were going to be the people paying attention to the work, not the ones managing an established story about what I was supposed to become. That was the lesson. I filed it alongside everything else, commissioned into the United States Navy as an ensign, and went to find my ship. The work was beginning. It would not stop for a very long time. The gap between what I was building and what my family understood me to be doing opened slowly. The way such gaps always do, not through a single dramatic event, but through years of parallel motion in different directions. I was advancing. They were remembering a version of me that had stopped being accurate around the time of my first promotion. By the time the distance became genuinely visible, it had already been in place long enough to feel like something permanent, like the walls of a room that had been furnished and decorated and lived in until no one remembered choosing the arrangement. In 2003, I earned my Surface Warfare Officer qualification aboard a surface combatant based out of Norfolk, Virginia. I was 27 years old and a lieutenant, 03. The qualification meant I could fight the ship, every major system, every emergency procedure, every scenario the ocean and an adversary could produce. Propulsion casualties, weapons employment, damage control under fire. The qualifying process is unambiguous in its demands. A ship does not have opinions about your family background or your father's understanding of your career. You either know the ship or you don't, and the qualifying board that examined me was not inclined toward charity toward anyone, including an officer whose fitness reports had been uniformly excellent. I passed. My commanding officer's fitness report that cycle used the words, "exceptional war-fighting instincts," and recommended me for department head. I called home with the news. My mother asked whether I was eating enough. My father asked if I was still on shore duty. I was not on shore duty. I had not been on shore duty in 4 years. I did not correct either of them. I had already begun developing the habit of not correcting the version of my career that my family carried, because the corrections required more scaffolding than the conversations could support. To explain the distinction between shore duty and sea duty in terms that would actually register, to explain what a surface warfare qualification represented in terms of sustained preparation and demonstrated competence, to read aloud from a fitness report that used the word exceptional. All of it required a listener who had first agreed to be curious, and curiosity was the one resource my family had never managed to direct toward my actual life in the Navy. I told my father I was doing well and that the sea time was valuable experience. Both statements were true. I left the rest in the work, where it would keep. In 2010, I was 34 years old and a lieutenant commander, 04, home on leave when my brother Brandon, then 19, announced at the dinner table that he had decided to enlist in the Navy. My father raised his glass immediately, the way a man raises a glass when something he has been waiting for finally arrives. My mother put both hands over her heart. The energy in that dining room was unlike anything I had generated in the same space across the previous decade. Genuine, uncomplicated family joy, the specific warmth of a household that has recognized something it has been orienting itself toward without knowing it. Brandon looked directly at me when he said it. I want to be out there, actually serving, on a ship. The emphasis on actually was deliberate, and I heard it, but I also understood that he was performing primarily for our father, and that the performance was the natural product of a young man who had absorbed the family's framework so thoroughly that he could not see the woman sitting across the table through any lens other than the one that framework provided. I had been going to sea for 11 years at that point. I held my glass, set it down without drinking, and asked what rating he was thinking of pursuing. He said he wasn't sure yet. I told him he had time to figure it out. He enlisted in 2010 as a seaman recruit, E1, and advanced steadily through the early enlisted ratings. Seaman apprentice, then seaman, then petty officer 3rd class by 2012. The family tracked each step of his advancement with a close and consistent attention they had never applied to my own progression through the officer ranks. My mother kept a small notebook with his ratings written in order, each one underlined when it was confirmed. My father talked about Brandon's destroyer at every family gathering with the specific pride of a man watching something he had always valued arrive in the place he expected it to belong. In 2013, I was selected for command. I would take the helm of a destroyer, a warship with 280 sailors in my direct responsibility. I was a commander, 05, and the selection was the product of an unblemished record across 14 years of uninterrupted sea service and leadership roles that had each required more than the one before it. I called home to share the news. Brandon picked up. The call started warmly enough. He asked how things were going. I told him. Then he said his division chief had been mentioning that women often moved through promotions quickly because of diversity and inclusion considerations, and he asked me directly, without apparent cruelty, with what seemed to him like honest curiosity, whether that was kind of how it had worked in my case. I was silent for a specific number of seconds. I counted them. Then I said, evenly and without edge, "My record speaks for itself." I changed the subject. Brandon did not push. The call ended normally from the outside. Inside, I made a decision I had been moving toward for years. I stopped trying to explain my career to him. Not out of anger, out of recognition. Explanation requires a listener who has agreed to hear it, and Brandon had been given a framework by our father that answered his questions before he thought to ask them. I could not correct that framework by offering facts. I would have had to replace it entire, and he would have had to want that replacement. He did not want it. Not yet. Not for another 12 years. In 2015, I was 39 years old and home for a family dinner celebrating Brandon's promotion to Petty Officer Second Class E5. My father made a toast to the Owens who actually went to the fleet. I had commanded a destroyer. I raised my glass and I did not say what I was thinking. After dinner, my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen and told me gently that she worried Brandon sometimes felt a little overshadowed by my success, and that she would appreciate it if I would not make it about ranks when the subject came up around him. She said it with love and without awareness of its full weight. She genuinely believed she was managing a delicate situation with care. She was. She just did not understand that what she was asking me to do was actively diminish myself in order to protect my brother's comfort inside a narrative that had never accurately described me. I looked at my mother for a long moment. Then I said, "Of course." I finished the dishes alone while Brandon and my father watched football in the other room. Their voices came through the doorway, comfortable, familiar, at ease with each other, in a way that required no explanation on either side. My commander's warfare insignia sat on the hallway credenza next to Brandon's Petty Officer Second Class Crow. Nobody in that house mentioned either one. Nobody in that house was going to. That was the last warning before everything I had built arrived on its own terms. I filed it the way I filed everything, and I carried it forward through the next decade. Commander to captain, captain to Rear Admiral lower half, Rear Admiral lower half to Rear Admiral upper half, to Commander of Surface Forces, Pacific Fleet, with 2 stars on my collar and a fleet to manage, and the steady forward motion of 26 years of service that had never once needed an audience to keep moving. The work did not require anyone's attention to remain real. It had always been real. It always would be. On Monday, the 17th of November, 2025, I reviewed the Operational Readiness Inspection Packet for a destroyer squadron at Naval Base San Diego, the same way I reviewed every inspection packet in the 14 months since I had taken command of Surface Forces, Pacific Fleet. Methodically, beginning to end, with the specific and practiced attention that flag-level oversight requires. I was 49 years old and a Rear Admiral upper half, 08, and unannounced operational readiness inspections were a core function of my command. I conducted them routinely. The point of an unannounced inspection is to see what is actually there, not what a command can produce when given time to arrange itself for an audience. My aide, Lieutenant Commander James Okafor, had the packet organized by ship and department. It was thorough work. Okafor had been with me for 14 months and understood how I preferred information structured. As I worked through the packet, I noted that Petty Officer Second Class Brandon Owens, E5, was listed among the watchstanding personnel of the USS Carrington, one of the destroyers in the squadron. Junior enlisted sailors are not briefed on flag officer itineraries. That is not a policy of exclusion, it is simply a matter of operational security and the practical reality that flag visit schedules are need to know at the appropriate levels. Brandon would not know I was coming. I did not alter the inspection itinerary. I put the packet down and went home. That evening, Captain Denise Reyes called from Naval Station Bremerton, Washington, on a separate professional matter regarding surface warfare readiness assessments we were both tracking. At the end of the call, she asked offhand whether Brandon was stationed in San Diego. I told her Naval Base San Diego. Yes. A pause. She asked if he knew I was coming. I said no. Junior enlisted aren't read into flag itineraries. That's simply how it works. Denise didn't ask further. She has known me since we were ensigns together in Newport in 1999, and she knows when I have already thought through whatever needs thinking through. I closed the inspection packet. I was not going to San Diego to find my brother. I was going to inspect a squadron. He happened to be assigned to it. There was no arrangement, there was no plan. There never needed to be. I arrived at the quarterdeck of the USS Carrington on Tuesday, November 18th, at 08:15 in the morning. Dress blues, 2 stars on my collar, the insignia of a Rear Admiral upper half, 08. Surface warfare pins, command pins, 26 years of earned insignia arranged precisely in accordance with uniform regulations. My aide detail was standard for a flag visit. Small, professional, unobtrusive, positioned to facilitate the inspection rather than announce it. I had made this kind of arrival dozens of times across multiple commands, and I moved through the protocol the same way I moved through everything. Present in the fact of what I was, without performance, without adjustment. Brandon was standing watch nearby with two members of his section, Petty Officer First Class Kyle Marsh, E6, 29 years old, and Petty Officer Third Class Devin Tate, E4, 23 years old. He saw my face. He processed it the only way he had ever processed me, through the family's framework, which told him I was the bookish one, the one who had taken the easier path, the one whose rank had arrived through mechanism rather than merit. He looked at my uniform and read it as costume. He had been given that reading years before, and he had never once examined it against any available evidence. In front of his watch section, with the confidence of a man performing for an audience he trusts and in a room he believes he understands, my brother said, "Playing dress-up, sis? Did Mom iron that for you?" Kyle Marsh laughed. Devin Tate grinned. Several others nearby exchanged glances. I caught from the periphery that some of them were already reading my collar devices, already registering exactly what the 2 stars meant, already beginning to understand what was about to happen. Brandon was not reading anything. He was performing. He was giving the room what the family's framework had equipped him to give, which was a joke at the expense of a bookish older sister who had dressed herself up in something she hadn't earned. I did not respond. I stood at the base of the gangway as protocol requires, waiting for the host officer to come down and receive my arrival. Standing at the base of a gangway awaiting honors is the correct behavior for a flag officer arriving aboard a ship. I was executing it correctly, as I have executed every piece of protocol I have ever been required to perform. I had also been waiting for things like this one, not this specific thing, but the general experience of being fundamentally misread, in a room where I was the most senior and most qualified person present for the better part of 26 years. 2 more minutes cost me nothing. At 0817, Rear Admiral Lower Half Marcus Halsworth, 07, the squadron commander, 57 years old with flag protocol embedded in his muscle memory from years of practice, came down the gangway. He saw my collar. He stopped moving. He came to full attention and rendered a parade ground salute, the kind that has the body doing the right thing before the conscious mind finishes processing the situation, the kind that is not performed for an audience, but is simply the correct physical response to what stands before you, the kind you render when you are in the presence of a superior officer, and there is no other appropriate thing to do. And he said, "Welcome aboard, Admiral Owens, ma'am." 5 words, the protocol words, exactly what you say when a 2-star arrives at your ship. Nothing arranged, nothing dramatic. Simply the correct words in the correct order at the correct moment, spoken by a man whose career had prepared him to say them, and who said them without hesitation. I returned the salute with the precision of 26 years of practice, and stepped into position beside Halsworth as he fell in to escort me up the gangway. In the 4 seconds between his salute and my first step onto the brow, the quarterdeck underwent a complete renegotiation of reality. Kyle Marsh snapped to rigid attention so fast he nearly lost his cover. Devin Tate's face went completely still, every trace of the grin erased as though it had never been there. The laughter was gone. The pier went silent in the specific way that only happens when a large number of people simultaneously understand something they cannot unsay and cannot take back. Every man who had laughed now understood with absolute clarity that he had laughed at a rear admiral. Brandon's jaw dropped. The story is accurate about that. I heard the quiet spreading down the pier behind me as I walked up the gangway, and I did not look back. There was nothing behind me that required my attention. I conducted a rigorous and thorough 2-day operational readiness inspection of that squadron. I examined combat readiness, damage control posture, maintenance records, training documentation, watch qualification status, and operational planning across every ship in the squadron. I spoke with sailors at every level, from department heads to the most junior watchstanders. I did not seek out Brandon. I did not reference what had happened at the quarterdeck to anyone, not to Halsworth, not to Okafor, not at the wardroom dinner that first evening when a young lieutenant's eyes tracked carefully toward me in a way that suggested he had already heard. I asked about engineering readiness scores. I asked about an upcoming training certification. I thanked the wardroom for their hospitality, ate my meal, and remained exactly who I was throughout. An inspector doing her job, without performance, without adjustment, without letting the pier enter the inspection even for a moment. On the morning of November 19th, I walked off the brow. Rear Admiral Halsworth rendered honors at the gangway. I returned them crisply and stepped into my vehicle. The car pulled away. Behind it, standing very still on the pier, was Brandon Owens. The drive back to headquarters was quiet. Lieutenant Commander Okafor had been on the pier and had been present for every hour of the 2-day inspection. He had seen everything. He did not mention the quarterdeck during the drive, and I did not mention it either. I reviewed inspection notes on a tablet for the first 20 minutes, then set the tablet down and looked out the window at the harbor moving past. The water was flat and silver in the November morning light. San Diego always looks this way in the fall, clear, too blue, slightly unreal from the right angle. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There's a kind of silence that is not emptiness. It is the silence you go to when you need to be clear before you are anything else. When the feelings are real and present and require a particular quiet that conversation would interrupt. I have lived in that silence for most of my career. I know its texture and its uses, and I was using it correctly on the drive back from Naval Base San Diego on November 19th. That evening I called Captain Denise Reyes from my home in Coronado. I told her what happened on the pier precisely and without editorializing, the comment, the laughter, the 5 words, the silence that spread down the pier, the 2 days of inspection I conducted as though none of it had been part of the mission, because none of it had been. Denise was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "Did he really say that?" I told her he did. She asked what I was going to do about it. I said, "Nothing. It's already done." We talked for close to an hour after that, and it was the kind of conversation that only works between 2 people who have known each other for 26 years and have earned the particular shorthand that long friendship produces. We talked about Brandon's decade of stagnation at E5, 10 years at the same pay grade, while I moved from captain to Rear Admiral lower half to Rear Admiral upper half and took command of a fleet. We talked about our mother Linda's long habit of managing the family narrative in ways that always, somehow, landed most comfortably for Brandon. We talked about the 2013 phone call and the diversity comment, and my decision after that call to stop trying to explain myself. We talked about the 2015 family dinner and the kitchen afterward, and the sound of football coming through the doorway while I finished the dishes. Denise listened to all of it the way she has always listened to me, without rushing to a verdict, without performing sympathy she didn't feel, with the specific quality of attention that makes her genuinely valuable as both a colleague and a friend. The thing I kept returning to, I told her, was not what Brandon said on the pier. It was that he had never asked. Not once. Not in 26 years of my career. Not one question about what my work actually required, what commanding a ship meant in terms of daily reality, what I had been responsible for, and to whom, and at what specific cost. He had received a story from our father and repeated it across years and never once checked it against the subject of the story herself. That is not cruelty. That is never having looked. There is a genuine difference between those 2 things, and the difference has always mattered to me, because cruelty would be something I'd know how to categorize and respond to. Indifference of that particular kind, the indifference of someone who has a perfectly sufficient story and sees no reason to check it, that is harder to know what to do with. In the quiet evenings of the days that followed, I did not stew. I have never been a person who stews. I cataloged. Not on paper, I have never needed paper for this kind of internal accounting. In my own mind, I went through what 26 years actually contains. 3 sea commands, deployments across 2 theaters, the qualifications I had earned on every ship I'd served, beginning with the Surface Warfare Officer pin in 2003 and accumulating from there. 43 enlisted sailors I personally recommended for advancement and whose careers I tracked afterward, because that is what you do when you put your name behind someone. You do not hand them a recommendation and walk away. The fitness reports I wrote across 2 decades of command that shaped other people's trajectories, in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes not. The department heads and executive officers and commanding officers I helped develop through counsel, through feedback, through the kind of honest assessment that is more difficult to give than praise, and more valuable than praise when it is received. I placed that record alongside the version of my career my family had been carrying for 30 years. The two records did not match. They had never matched. The gap between them was wide enough to fit a career through and still have room. On Monday, November 24th, I received the draft inspection report on the destroyer squadron. 3 areas required corrective action from the squadron's leadership. None of them were related to Brandon or to anything connected to what happened on the pier. I reviewed the document carefully, made 2 notations in the margins regarding supporting documentation, and signed off. In a routine watch section performance log that formed part of the inspection package, Petty Officer 2nd Class Brandon Owens appeared once in a standard watch record entry. Unremarkable in every particular, neither positive nor negative. The kind of entry that appears in hundreds of watch logs across any squadron during any inspection cycle. I read the entry. I moved to the next page. I signed the document and did not add a notation and did not remove one. I gave his actions on the pier the precise official weight they warranted under the scope of my inspection mandate. 0, because they occurred entirely outside that scope. 0 was the appropriate response. 0 was the only response I was going to give. I set my pen down on the signed inspection report and looked out the window of my headquarters office. A destroyer was moving slowly through the harbor channel toward open water, the kind of sight that, after 26 years, still catches something in me. Not nostalgia, exactly. Something more like recognition. I know what is happening on that bridge right now, what the officer of the deck is tracking, what the lookouts are scanning, what the engineering officer is monitoring below. I know it because I have done it, repeatedly, under every condition the sea offers. I watched the ship move until it cleared the channel entrance. Then I turned back to my desk and picked up the next document in the stack. The work does not pause for reflection any more than it pauses for weather. That is something I learned early, and it has served me well every day since. There's something I want to say about what it feels like to carry 26 years of invisible work in a world that has decided, on insufficient evidence, what category you belong to. It does not feel, after long enough, like injustice, not the sharp-edged kind, anyway. It settles into something more ambient, something you navigate around the way you navigate any persistent condition of the environment, without drama, without resentment, with the kind of practiced management that eventually becomes so automatic you stop noticing the management and only notice the occasional jarring moment when the environment is briefly, unexpectedly different. The pier on November 18th was that kind of moment. Not the injustice being corrected. Injustice rarely corrects itself that cleanly. Just a moment when what was true and what was visible briefly occupied the same space at the same time. I had waited 26 years for that particular alignment. I had stopped expecting it would come this way. I had stopped expecting it would come at all. I sat at my kitchen table that week with a cup of tea and a briefing folder and thought, for the first time in years, about what it means to be genuinely tired of a particular kind of distance. Not angry, not wronged, tired in the specific way that accumulates from being unseen by the people who were supposed to know you first, over long enough that the distance stops feeling like something that happened to you and starts feeling like a condition of the landscape, like the shape of the ground you walk on, without giving the shape a name. I made no calls to Brandon's chain of command. I did not flag the incident in any official communication, did not ask for a report, did not reach into the institution and make something happen. The Navy runs on rank and protocol, and what happened on that quarterdeck had been witnessed by everyone who needed to witness it. My silence was not mercy. It was precision. I had done my job. The institution would do its own work through the channels it was designed for, and I trusted those channels the way I have always trusted the system I have spent my career operating inside. A system works when the people within it do not circumvent it for personal reasons. I was not going to circumvent it now. A ship is a sealed environment. Word does not travel in a sealed environment, it detonates. Every sailor aboard a commissioned warship knows this, including Petty Officer 2nd Class Brandon Owens. He had been aboard destroyers long enough to know exactly how information moved through the berthing spaces and the mess decks and the passageways, how a story caught once in the right ear could reach every berthing space before the next watch section rotation. He had just forgotten, in the moment of performing for his watch section, where he was standing and what he was standing next to. By Thursday of that week, the full account had reached every berthing space in the squadron. Not a distorted account, not a rumor that had been shaped in transit, the actual account. From multiple witnesses who had been on the pier and who all told the same story because there was only one story to tell. By Friday, Brandon's division chief had heard 3 separate, independent versions, each consistent with the others in every material detail. The following Monday, November 24th, the same day I signed off on the inspection report, his division officer, Lieutenant Amara Willis, called him in for an informal counseling session. She was 27 years old, 03, 4 years commissioned. She was not unkind in how she handled it. She read back from the watchstander reports what had been witnessed on the pier. The comment, the laughter, the salute, the silence, the inspection that followed for 2 full days. Then she said, "The quarterdeck is not a comedy stage, Petty Officer Owens. Flag officers are not costume." She wrote a notation in the division log. Informal, uncontested, not a formal charge or a written counseling of the kind that triggers formal review, but permanent. It would sit in his service record. It would be there the next time a board looked at his file, and the time after that, and every time after that. I was not in that room. I have sat on the other side of that kind of table many times over 20 years, in various commands and various circumstances, delivering various assessments to sailors who needed to hear something plainly stated before they could do anything useful with it. I know what those conversations feel like from the side of the desk that does the speaking, and I can reconstruct what they feel like from the other side with reasonable accuracy. Being formally corrected about a rear admiral's dignity by a lieutenant who commissioned 22 years after that rear admiral, that is its own specific kind of reckoning. It does not announce itself as dramatic. It simply lands and then continues to land in quiet moments in the passageway and at chow and lying in the rack at night when there is nothing between a person and the thing they have done. My own operational tempo did not change. I was managing a fleet, and a fleet does not pause. Reports, orders, briefings, staff coordination, preparation for a surface warfare senior leader symposium that was scheduled for January. I added notes to presentation files. I reviewed readiness data from commands across the Pacific. I worked late most evenings, which was neither unusual nor particularly notable. I have worked late most evenings for the better part of 26 years, and the work has never become less than it is, only different in its particular demands. I was not waiting for anything from Brandon. I was not waiting for anything from my family. I had learned to stop waiting for particular things from particular people by living long enough without those things to understand that the work did not require their acknowledgement to remain real. The work was real regardless. It had always been. One evening that week, I sat at my kitchen table in Coronado with a cup of tea that went cold before I finished it, and a briefing folder open in front of me. And I thought for a sustained moment about the specific mathematics of what had happened on the pier. The 2 stars on my collar represent an 08 pay grade, a fleet command, and 26 years of qualification, deployment, leadership, and sustained accountability. The laughter that came from the quarterdeck on the morning of November 18th came from an E6 and an E4, and several other enlisted sailors, who looked at a woman in dress blues and read her as a woman in costume. That gap, the gap between what I am and what they saw in the moment before they understood, is exactly the same gap that my family has been living inside for 30 years. It is not a gap I created. It is not a gap that belongs to me. It is the gap that exists between a story and the subject of that story when no one has checked the distance between them in a long time. I did not feel victorious about what happened on that pier. I want to be careful to say that clearly because triumph would be the easy thing to feel, and I did not feel it. What I felt, if I name it honestly, was tired. The specific fatigue that comes from being unseen by the people who were supposed to know you first. The people for whom the seeing should have required no effort, no external prompt, no admiral's salute on a Navy pier to make the evidence legible. After long enough, that fatigue does not feel like injury. It feels like weather, cold, persistent, part of the landscape you move through, rather than something that happens to you on a particular day. You keep doing the work inside it because the work does not stop for weather. It never did. It never will. I closed the briefing folder and left it on the table. The Pacific outside was dark and flat, the lights of the Coronado Bridge strung across the distance. I was exactly where I'd always been, still working, still moving forward, still the same woman who had commissioned in Newport in 1999 with no family in the audience and had simply gone to find her ship. There is something that happens in the Navy when the record corrects someone's story without any intervention from the person the story was about. I have seen it happen to others over the years, the moment when what a sailor believed about a colleague or a superior turns out to be demonstrably wrong, and the wrong is made visible not through argument but through the simple arrival of evidence. The correction doesn't require the subject to say anything. It requires only that the truth and the person who disbelieved it end up in the same space at the same time. On November 18th, in front of a destroyer's quarterdeck watch section, 26 years of my career and my brother's decade of dismissal of it arrived in the same space at the same time. Rear Admiral Marcus Halsworth rendered the truth legible in 5 words, none of which were about Brandon, none of which were addressed to Brandon, none of which needed to be. The quarterdeck made the correction. I had nothing to do with it. I was simply present, the way I have been present for 26 years, doing the job the way the job requires it to be done. That is what makes the pier exactly what it was. Not something I engineered, not something I arranged, not something I had planned and waited for. It was simply my career, arriving on a Tuesday morning, in the form it was always going to arrive in eventually. I had been patient. I had kept working. The world had, in the end, run out of room to keep getting it wrong. What happened to Brandon in the days after the inspection, I know partly from what he told me later, and partly from 26 years of understanding how a ship's social world functions when someone has publicly and completely misread a situation that everyone else in the vicinity processed correctly in real time. The morning after the inspection, his watch section was different. Kyle Marsh did not meet his eyes at quarters. Devon Tate gave him wide clearance in the passageways, the kind of clearance that is not hostility, but is the unmistakable physical expression of a person who has received information that has permanently reorganized their understanding of a relationship and does not yet know what to do with the reorganization. Sailors he barely knew looked at him with an expression that was not contempt. Contempt would have been cleaner, but something more complicated. Something in the register of knowing that requires no commentary to communicate. By Thursday, the full account had reached every berthing space in the squadron. By Friday, his division chief had enough independent versions to act on. And through all of it, Brandon was doing something he had not done in a very long time, possibly ever, sitting with something he could not deflect, could not root around through the family's framework, could not file under any of the inherited categories that had served him so reliably for so many years. He told me later that on the night after the inspection, lying in his rack at 2200 hours, unable to sleep, the ship's ventilation system running its steady background hum, he pulled up my official Navy biography on his phone. The publicly available version on the Navy's website, 4 paragraphs of dry institutional language that describes a career in the terms the Navy uses, which are precise and unambiguous, and completely indifferent to whatever story anyone outside the institution might have been carrying. Commissioned, 1999. Surface Warfare Officer qualified. Department Head, Executive Officer, Commanding Officer. Multiple deployments in 2 theaters. Commander, Destroyer Squadron. Rear Admiral, Lower Half, 2022. Rear Admiral, Upper Half, 2024. Commander, Surface Forces, Pacific Fleet. He read it twice. He told me later he kept having the thought that it must be the wrong Sandra Owens, that there had to be some other woman with my name who had done these things. There's only one. There's only ever been one. He read the biography a 3rd time and then put the phone face down on his chest and lay in the dark. Several days later, he asked Kyle Marsh at lunch whether Kyle had known I had commanded a destroyer. Kyle didn't look up from his tray. Yeah, man, we all looked her up. A pause long enough to carry its own meaning. Brandon said, I didn't. Kyle looked at him then, not with contempt, just with something flat and completely honest, the expression of a man delivering a fact that does not surprise either of them, but still needs to be said out loud. We figured. They finished their meal. The conversation ended there. It did not need to go further. Everyone around Brandon had done the obvious, available thing that Brandon had never thought to do. His ignorance was not collective, and it was not accidental. It was specifically his, the product of a story he had chosen to carry rather than examine. And every person in his watch section had already understood this before he arrived at the understanding himself. He tried to call our mother one evening. He reached voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He sat for a while holding the phone, then opened his contacts and scrolled to my name, listed simply as Sandra, no title and no rank, just the first name he had saved years ago, when the distance between us was already wide and still widening. He stared at the name for a long time. He was not ready. He put the phone face down on his rack and lay in the dark with the ship's engines a low vibration beneath him, present with something true for the first time in a long time. And the something true was uncomfortable enough that he did not want to be alone with it and did not yet know who else to take it to. In the days that followed, he began doing something he had not done before, testing the specific claims he had made about my career, to himself, to his shipmates, in family conversations over the years, against what he actually knew from his own direct observation rather than from inheritance. He tried to identify what he actually knew about my record, separate from what his father had told him and what his mother had implicitly confirmed through her choices about what to discuss and what to leave alone. He thought about the last time he had genuinely talked to me, not a performative holiday call in which both parties managed the distance between them with pleasantries, but an actual conversation in which he had listened with the intention of understanding something. He could not name a year. He could not name a specific exchange. He had been going to sea for 15 years, and he had never asked me what it was like to be at sea, never asked what I was responsible for, never asked a single question that would have required me to answer as myself rather than as the family's version of me. He showed up to his watch sections on time that week. He qualified for a maintenance evolution he had been putting off without any particular justification. He was not fixed. He was not absolved. He was beginning, which is its own kind of work, and which requires exactly the kind of patience that Brandon had never previously applied to anything involving me. The ship moved on its operational schedule. The watch rotations turned. In the dark of his berthing, Brandon Owens lay in his rack with his phone face up on his chest and my name on the screen, and he stayed with what was true rather than what had been convenient. That is not nothing. At 34 years old, for someone who has been running a particular story for most of his adult life, that is the necessary beginning. The hardest part of that kind of reckoning, I know this from watching other people go through versions of it over the years, and I know it from my own experience of different but related confrontations with what I had chosen to believe, is that it requires you to hold two things at once. The first is what you were given, the second is what you chose to do with it once you were old enough and informed enough to have looked for yourself. Those two things are not the same, and refusing to separate them is a way of avoiding accountability that presents itself as loyalty. Brandon had been given a framework by our father, a framework that was built in good faith from Robert Owens's genuine beliefs about military service and its categories. That framework was inaccurate in several significant respects, but Brandon had been repeating it and reinforcing it for years after he had access to evidence that could have corrected it, had he chosen to look. He did not choose to look. Until now. Lying in his rack on the USS Carrington in late November of 2025, Brandon Owens was in the process of separating those two things for the first time. What his father handed him and what he chose to keep carrying. The distinction was uncomfortable. He stayed with it anyway because the ship kept moving and the watch rotations kept turning and there was nowhere else to go with it and nothing to do but stay with what was true. He thought about me at officer candidate school, which he knew nothing about. He thought about me on the bridge of a destroyer, which he had never pictured. He thought about what it would mean to be responsible for a ship and everyone on it. 280 people, their safety, their readiness, the consequences of every decision made at every hour of every day at sea. He had been on destroyers. He knew what a ship was. He just had never applied what he knew about ships to what he knew about me, had never placed the two pieces of information in the same room and asked what they produced together. Now he was doing it. In the dark of his berthing, with the ship's engines running below him and nowhere to be until the next watch, he was finally doing it. Brandon came to Senior Chief Petty Officer Leonard Garza, ostensibly to discuss his advancement exam timeline, a conversation he had been avoiding for months for reasons that had more to do with the embarrassment of his own stagnation than with anything on the scheduling calendar. He had been at E5 for 10 years. 10 years at the same pay grade, without promotion, on a ship that continued to operate around him, while his contemporaries from his early enlistment moved up or moved on. Garza had been watching this with a patient and specific attention for as long as he had been Brandon's division chief, watching the way a senior chief watches a sailor who is capable of more than they are currently producing, which is with less sympathy than the sailor usually wants and more precision than the sailor usually expects. Garza was 44 years old and an E8, a senior chief petty officer who had earned every chevron through years of demonstrated excellence and sustained leadership. He redirected the conversation within 4 minutes of Brandon sitting down across from him because the advancement exam timeline was a pretext, and Garza was not inclined toward pretexts. He asked, "Your sister is Admiral Owens?" Brandon said yes, Garza said without ceremony and without building up to it. "I sat through one of her briefings at a fleet symposium in 2023. She doesn't mess around." He said it the way senior chiefs say things that need to be said, plainly, without editorial, with the quiet expectation that the person on the other side of the desk is capable of receiving information and doing something useful with it. Not a speech, not a life lesson, just a fact, delivered by someone whose credibility was not in question. Brandon said he hadn't known about the symposium. He hadn't known about a lot of things about my career, as it turned out, though he was only beginning to take the full inventory. Garza looked at him for a moment. "Now you do. What are you going to do with it?" That question, the plainest question, the most direct question, the question that the family had never thought to ask in any direction for 30 years, landed with a weight that Brandon told me later he had not expected. Not because it was unkind, because it was honest. Garza was not trying to shame him or push him toward a particular answer. He was asking what a senior chief asks when he has given a sailor the information they needed and is now genuinely curious whether the sailor is going to use it. Brandon did not have an answer in that room. He left the division chief's office with the question still in his hands, and he carried it with him through the rest of the day and into the evening. That night in his berthing, Brandon took out the small notepad he kept in his rack for watch notes, the kind of pad a sailor keeps for quick entries during a watch rotation. Nothing elaborate, and he wrote 2 lists. The first was what he actually knew about my career from sources he could verify. The Navy biography he had read 3 times on his phone, what Garza had said about the symposium, what Kyle Marsh had said about all of them looking me up. The first list was short. It fit on a few lines. The second list was what he had assumed, repeated, or inherited from our father and mother without ever checking it against available evidence. That list went on considerably longer than he expected. He wrote for several minutes. He tore the page out when he was done and sat with it in his hands, looking at the 2 lists and what they said about the gap between the story he had been carrying and the subject of that story. He thought about our father, not with anger, because anger would have been simpler and less honest, but with something more complicated. Robert Owens worked hard for everything he had. He was a man of genuine conviction and real capability who had given 30 years of his life to the Army and who loved his family in the direct and often inarticulate way that men of his generation and his particular formation express love. He had also never served at sea, never seen his daughter in command of anything, never looked at her fitness reports or her command selection results or her record in any form that would have required him to update his picture of who she was beyond the category he had assigned her when she was 6 years old. He told Brandon what he believed. He could not have told him what he knew because the knowledge was not there. What Brandon had been doing for years, in phone calls and family dinners and conversations with his watch section and in the quiet assumptions he made about why my promotions arrived the way they did, was repeating his father's beliefs after he was old enough and sufficiently positioned to have checked them himself. The distinction between what Robert handed him and what Brandon chose to keep carrying was new territory. It was uncomfortable in a way he had not expected. He stayed with it. He called our mother in early December, after another evening of not being able to call me. Linda answered on the second ring. After the routine check-in, "How are you? How's the ship? Are you eating enough?" Brandon asked. "Mom, when did you last actually ask Sandra about her job? What she does day to day, what she's responsible for, what a normal week looks like?" Linda said they talked about it sometimes. He asked what I had actually told her. There was a pause, a long one, the kind that happens when someone is genuinely searching for content and finding less than they expected. "Well, she doesn't really talk about it much," Brandon said quietly. "No, we never asked." Linda said something about me always being private, always self-contained, always the one who managed her own affairs without inviting commentary. Brandon said, "Or we just never made space for it." He did not push further, and he did not accuse. He ended the call on warm terms, said he would call again soon, and hung up. Then he opened his contacts. My name on the screen, just Sandra. No title and no rank. He held the phone. He was almost ready. He went up to the weather deck on a clear evening, the kind of San Diego evening that makes the Pacific look like something from a painting. Too blue, too still, the horizon line exact. He stood at the railing and looked out at the water with the city's lights in the distance. And he thought about me not as the Admiral or as the family's inconvenient exhibit of achievement, but as his actual sister. The woman who had stood in dress whites at a commissioning ceremony in Newport with no family in the audience. Who had stood on the bridge of a warship with 280 people in her care and made decisions that mattered. He had spent 34 years knowing almost nothing about my actual life, and the only information he had was secondhand from people who also knew almost nothing. He went below. He picked up the phone. He dialed. The call did not connect. I was in a meeting. He ended it before the second ring, without leaving a voicemail, without saying what he had come to say. Not yet. But he had found the beginning of the sentence. That was enough for one night. I learned all of this later, in pieces, during and after the call that finally happened. I tell it now because it matters, not as context for what Brandon did on the pier, which requires no additional context but to show what came after it. The pier was one moment. What came after it was a man actually doing the work that the moment demanded of him, without being watched, without an audience, in the compressed and long memory world of a Navy ship where there was nowhere to hide from what he had done and no one to perform accountability for. He did it anyway. Alone, in his berthing, in the mess hall at lunch, in the division chief's office, on the weather deck at dusk, with the Pacific in front of him and the phone in his hand. That is the part of the story that I find myself returning to, in the weeks and months since December 9th. Not the pier. What came after it. 3 weeks passed between the quarterdeck and the call that mattered. For me, those weeks were full in the way that a fleet command is always full. Operational schedules, readiness assessments, the steady forward motion of responsibility that does not pause for family situations and does not wait for personal things to find their resolution. A fleet command is a large and uninterrupted thing. I flew to Washington in early December for a surface warfare planning conference at the Pentagon and presented the Surface Force's Pacific Readiness Assessment to a senior leadership audience that included Vice Admiral Patricia Chen, 09, my superior officer, 59 years old, one of the sharpest and most demanding operational minds I have had the privilege of working alongside in my career. During a break in the conference, VADM Chen stepped alongside me briefly. Thorough inspection report on the squadron, as always. I thanked her. She moved on to the next thing. That was the entirety of the reference to the inspection that became the most discussed event in Brandon's professional world that month. No one in that conference room at the Pentagon knew about the quarterdeck at Naval Base San Diego. No one in that room knew who Brandon Owens was, what he had said, or what had happened in the 4 seconds between his comment and Rear Admiral Halsworth's salute. My professional world had continued without a ripple, at full operational tempo, because the quarterdeck incident, which had collapsed Brandon's social world aboard ship and sent him into a genuine and private reckoning, was, for me, a Tuesday morning in a very long career. I am not saying that to read as cold. I am saying it because it is the point. I have been carrying my own weight for long enough in a world that requires me to earn my presence every single day I walk into it. That a moment of recognition, however striking, however long in arriving, does not destabilize me. I was already what I was before Halsworth saluted. The salute confirmed it for the people who had not been paying attention. It did not create what it confirmed. I presented the afternoon brief at the conference, answered questions from the staff, and caught an evening flight back to San Diego. The work continued. It always does. On the evening of December 5th, Denise called. It was the second time since the pier that she had asked directly whether Brandon had called. I said not yet. She asked whether I thought he would. I was quiet for a longer moment than my usual conversational pace, which Denise noticed and let stand without interruption because she is good at that. I think this time it's real, I said. She asked what I wanted from it, if and when the call came. I thought about that question for a genuine moment before I answered, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a quick one. I want him to ask, I said. For once, just once, I want him to ask. Not because I owe him an answer, because a question would mean he's actually listening. A pause. Denise did not fill it. I've been talking to my family about my career for 26 years, I said. I've never had anyone on that side of the family actually listen. Denise said, He'll call. I didn't argue with her. I had begun to think the same thing, which was different from hoping it and different from expecting it. It was simply a read of the available evidence, and the available evidence was pointing in one direction. On Monday, December 8th, I made coffee at 05:30 in the morning the way I do every morning, checked my phone in the kitchen while the coffee was still brewing, and found no missed calls from Brandon. I put the phone face down and did not pick it up again until I was in my car. While the coffee brewed, I thought, not about the pier, not about the inspection, not about the official record in any of its forms, but about the version of my brother that had existed before. The distance between us solidified into something that neither of us had been actively maintaining, but neither of us had thought to dismantle. The 6-year-old who used to grab my hand at the county fair when the crowds got thick and he was scared and absolutely unwilling to show it. The kid who dragged me to windows to show me things he had noticed outside. Birds, weather, anything that struck him as remarkable. I did not know exactly when I had lost track of that version of him. I knew that I had never fully stopped wondering whether he was still somewhere inside the man who snickered on the pier on a November morning and looked at everything I had spent 26 years building and read it as a costume. There was something I wanted from the call if it came. Not vindication, not an itemized apology for every dismissal across every year, not a formal acknowledgement of the record. I wanted the thing Denise had given me decades ago on the night of a commissioning ceremony in Newport. Someone who was paying attention, someone who was looking at the actual subject of the story and asking what they saw, rather than reaching for the version they had been given and accepting it without inspection. That is a small thing and a very large thing simultaneously, and I had wanted it from my family for a very long time. On Tuesday, December 9th, I was midway through a routine staff meeting at headquarters, budget projections for the first quarter of the next fiscal year, a subject requiring full attention and offering none of the drama its importance would suggest, when my personal cell phone buzzed once on silent in my jacket pocket. I noted it. I did not check it during the meeting. When the agenda reached the scheduled 15-minute break at 10:15, I stepped out of the conference room and looked at the screen. One missed call, Brandon Owens, no voicemail. I stood in the corridor outside my conference room for a moment that was longer than it needed to be and shorter than it felt. The headquarters was busy around me, staff moving between offices, conversations in progress, the ordinary motion of a command at work. I was standing completely still in the middle of it. I was not afraid of the call. I was not rehearsing what I was going to say, because I have learned over 26 years that rehearsing conversations does not usually produce better conversations, only more anxious silences. I was simply making sure, in the particular way I have made sure of consequential things across a long career, that I was clear before I acted, that I was genuinely present, genuinely ready, before I pressed the button that would close the distance I had been carrying for as long as I could remember. The call was 26 years in the making. The corridor could wait 30 more seconds. I pressed call back at 10:28 in the morning. What I was standing in that corridor with, in the 30 seconds between finding the missed call and pressing call back, was not quite emotion and not quite calculation. It was something I have only been able to identify in retrospect, now that there is enough distance from the moment to look at it clearly. It was the particular quality of readiness that comes from having carried something for a very long time and recognizing that you are, finally, in the right place and the right moment to put it down, or rather, to offer it to someone who is now, finally, in a position to receive it. I had been carrying my career in one hand and my family's version of my career in the other for 26 years. The weight was not equal. One of those things was real and the other was a story, and I had never stopped knowing the difference even when the people around me appeared not to. Standing in that corridor with one missed call from my brother on the screen of my phone, I felt, for the first time in a long time, that the story might be ready to be replaced by the thing it had always been a poor substitute for. I pressed call back. Brandon answered on the first ring. I said, "Hey." He said, "Hey." There was a pause, long without being hostile. The kind of pause that belongs to two people who have been navigating around each other for so many years that a direct line between them requires a moment to locate. Then Brandon said, "I'm sorry, about the pier." I said, "I know." A breath, his, audible through the line. Then, "I didn't know what you were." And I said quietly, without accusation, without the catalog of grievances I could have opened and chose not to. "You never asked." He said, "No, I didn't." For the first time in 26 years, my brother wanted to know. Not the official biography, not the version our father had carried, not the story that had been circulating in the family for decades, like a document no one had bothered to update. The actual thing. He asked about officer candidate school. He asked about my first ship. He asked about the department head, about the executive officer, about commanding a destroyer. That last one stopped me for a moment, not because I didn't know how to answer, but because nobody in my family had ever asked it before. Not once in 12 years. So I told him. The 0-300 watch rotations. The Persian Gulf in summer. The fitness reports I wrote, knowing they would shape careers long after I had moved on. The specific moment in my first command tour when I understood, in my body rather than just my mind, that the ship responded to me, that 280 people were oriented around my judgment every single day. He asked what that felt like. I told him that too. Because he asked. That has always been reason enough. Near the end of the call, he said our father had always told him officers had the easy life. I thought carefully about how to answer, then told him the truth. Our father worked as hard as anyone I have ever known, but he never served at sea, and he never saw me in command. He told Brandon what he believed, not what he knew. Brandon said he was wrong. I said about some things, not everything, and I left it there. I was not interested in prosecuting a dead man or building Brandon's honesty on Robert Owens's collapse. I wanted him to step out of the inherited story on his own terms. He did. The call lasted 1 hour and 11 minutes. The longest conversation we had shared since childhood, though the length was not the point. The point was that he was listening. When I finished describing the destroyer command, he said, "That's incredible," and I believed him. I came home early that afternoon and sat with the December light coming through the windows and thought about what the call was and was not. It did not erase anything. But he had looked, really looked, at the actual subject of the story, rather than the version he had been handed. He saw it. He said so. After 26 years, that is not a small thing. You exhale, and then you keep going, because the job does not stop. It never has. That day didn't erase the years I spent being unseen, but it finally forced the truth into the open. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to explain myself again. I just needed the people who doubted me to finally look. Have you ever had someone realize too late that they underestimated you? Did you forgive them, walk away, or let your actions speak louder than words? Share your story in the comments. And if this reminded you of your own moment of reclaiming your worth, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next story.